Alright, let's start where we left off with the last session. I was talking about how Charles Darwin had observed the finches on the Galapagos Islands, and this diversity in part led him to conclude that natural selection was a primary driver of evolution. As I was saying, there's a tremendous variety of species of finches, all of which evolved from a potential common ancestor such as this generic little brown bird. This was a potential common ancestor from the South American mainland. Once this ancestor arrived on the Galapagos Islands, it differentiated over time, and there were sufficient barriers within populations to lead to a lot of new species evolving. And as I was saying, there are a lot of different species that have beaks suited to various different diets, but there's also a lot of variation in beak depth, and by beak depth I mean if you were to measure the depth of the beak, so from the top of the beak to the bottom of the beak at the widest point, there's actually quite a bit of variation within species as well. So these beak shapes are influenced by the environment quite heavily, and there's a pair of researchers, Peter and Rosemary Grant, who have studied the finches on Daphne, I think it's Daphne Major. I can't remember if it's Daphne Major or Daphne Minor, but it's a particular small island in the Galapagos, and they have studied finches there for over 40 years now. So they basically are very well versed in finch biology on this one island, and they have found that depending on the weather patterns and whether or not plants with large seeds thrive during certain years or plants with smaller seeds thrive, that will start a cascading effect on the reproductive success of the birds there. So birds that have deep beaks thrive during years following droughts in which only the larger seeded plant seeds survive, and birds with smaller or less deep beaks tend to thrive after wetter years, where the plants that produce small seeds do better. So this is a well-documented case of natural selection, and there's been many papers written about it since Charles Darwin first documented the finch diversity on the Galapagos. So Darwin's inescapable conclusion from his work was that natural selection was occurring, and there were two observations in particular that were neither profound nor original. The first of these facts is that more offspring are born than can survive. Okay, this is pretty intuitive. Of course, when you think about salmon, a single female salmon can lay hundreds or thousands of eggs, and typically only a handful of adult fish will survive long enough to return to their natal stream and reproduce themselves. So there's way more offspring that are born than can survive, and their survival is not random. One of the common misconceptions about evolution is that it's totally random, but this is not the case at all. Basically, organisms with favorable traits or favorable genes are more likely to survive in their environment and are thus more likely to reproduce. So that is not random at all. And the second fact is individual variation exists. This just means that individuals differ from one another. Whether or not that variation is actually visible to us as humans with the naked eye, or whether it's at the molecular level on a DNA-based level, there is individual variation, whether or not it's apparent to us. Okay, so this inescapable conclusion that Darwin was left with was that there is what's called unequal reproductive success. This simply means some individuals are going to be better at reproducing and leaving a genetic legacy than other individuals. So it's this unequal reproductive success that Darwin called natural selection. That's all that natural selection really boils down to. And of course, natural selection is just one of several major drivers of evolution. The product of natural selection is adaptation. Adaptation, of course, you can think of it as organisms that are particularly well suited to their environment. So an example of natural selection would be this population of beetles. So at the start of a selective process, there's a population with varied inherited traits. In this case, there are beetles with different wing coverings. The technical term for the hardened wing coverings on beetles is elytra. So there are different elytra shades here, ranging from almost white to like charcoal black. Okay, and then a predator comes in. This would be a selective pressure that might lead to adaptation. So there's going to be elimination of individuals with certain traits. In this case, these beetles live on a dark substrate, so the ground that they live on is very dark in color. Maybe it's a patch of forest that has recently been burned by a intense wildfire, and there's a lot of sooty soil on top. So these lighter colored beetles are not going to survive well. They're going to stick out like sore thumbs, and this bird is going to come in here and pick off all the ones that is really obvious to it. So this basically is culling some individuals from the population and leaving only the darker colored individuals that tend to survive better. Those individuals, of course, are going to reproduce, and there's gradually going to be an increasing frequency of traits that enhance survival and reproductive success. Artificial selection is kind of like natural selection on steroids. Humans have been manipulating plants and animals for a very long time now. With dogs, a lot of the dog breeds we see are only the result of a couple hundred years of intense artificial selection. Of course, historically, there were types that were not strictly defined as breeds, but more utilitarian types that were maintained based on their working abilities. And within the last couple hundred years, dog breeders have gotten much more specific with what they're looking for as far as phenotype or outward appearance. So we have a tremendous variety of dog breeds that are primarily distinguishable quite easily just based on their outward appearance. And then, of course, with agricultural products, all of these plants here, Brussels sprouts, red cabbage, kale, cauliflower, and broccoli, actually derive from a single wild type of plant here, and we've just been selectively breeding those types to provide us with food. So artificial selection is similar to natural selection, but instead of, say, a predator being the selective force, it's humans basically deciding which individuals get to reproduce. And of course, there are many examples of natural selection in action. One of these is the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Of course, with the use of antibiotics being quite widespread in industrial agriculture for the production of meat animals, that has been promoting the survival of strains that are resistant to antibiotics and has basically made modern medicine more challenging. Of course, you're all told that if you are prescribed an antibiotic to take the full course of antibiotics, even if you're feeling better, that's just to make sure that you don't basically culture a strain of resistant bacteria in your internal organs. So Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species fueled an explosion in biological research. Evolution is one of biology's best demonstrated, most comprehensive, and longest lasting theories. And again, it's the unifying theme of biology. And I just want to touch upon the word theory for a moment. A lot of people take theory to mean hunch or not a very well documented line of evidence. But when we're talking about a scientific theory, a theory is going to be one of the most well researched and basically one of the most well researched and best demonstrated lines of evidence. So it's not something that's just been around for a couple of years. The theories that we talk to you about in science, particularly evolution, are very well documented, and they are based on rigorous scientific research, and they have been continually tested and reaffirmed. So the word science is derived from a Latin verb meaning to know. So science can be thought of as a way of knowing. It has developed from our curiosity about ourselves and the world around us. It accounts for our understanding of nature, so all natural phenomena that we have gathered information about stem from scientific endeavors. And it's a continually self-correcting process. So if people find something out that contradicts previous scientific research, our body of knowledge grows and changes due to that new evidence. So it's not something that is not continually reevaluated. It's always reevaluated and retested, and our knowledge builds upon past knowledge. Science includes asking questions about nature and collecting data to answer those questions. So the basic scientific method I have outlined here, it begins with observation. It can be any sort of observation. It leads to a question being asked, a hypothesis, which is a formal statement, of what you believe to be true based on your observations and research. This leads to a prediction, and then this often leads to an experiment, although not all scientific research endeavors are experimental. Some of it is strictly observational and basically gathers evidence to support one's observations. If the experiment does not support the hypothesis, that hypothesis is revised, or a new hypothesis is put forth. If that experiment does support the hypothesis, additional predictions can be made, and then new experiments can be run. But an example, a very basic example of applying the scientific method to a common problem would be this following paragraph here. So the observation would be the TV remote doesn't work. Question would be what's wrong with the remote. Your hypothesis, your most common hypothesis in this situation anyway, are probably going to be that the batteries are dead. So your prediction is if you replace the batteries, then the remote will work. Your experiment is simply replacing the batteries with new ones. So if that solves the problem, then your hypothesis was correct. If that doesn't solve the problem, maybe there's something going on with the internal wiring within the remote. Maybe something's actually broken in it. So that would lead to a new hypothesis. Okay, so science can never prove a hypothesis. Science only supports a hypothesis or fails to support a hypothesis. So all organisms are made up of cells, and cells come from other cells. This is an example of a theory, and that is cell theory. Basically what I'm getting at there is you can put forth a theory and provide evidence for that theory, but you can never prove the theory. So our best evidence says that cell theory is correct, but you can't say you've proven cell theory.